Bertold.
Hi. Kannst du mich hören? Sag mal was. Ich höre nichts.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. As per the state theory for good corporate governance, environment is one of the stakeholders for a company globally. It is paramount for companies to take into account the contemporary concerns that are the same, and protecting the interest of stakeholders is one of the prime duties of any company worldwide. Even though attempting to tackle climate change require contribution to many different fronts. Business sustainability and responsibility reporting to strengthen the ESG disclosure regime by companies. It becomes mandatory for major public listed companies in India today. Corporations play a significant role in advancing the sustainability movement and the manner in which business conducts themselves in the market to achieve their sustainability goals, particularly in relation to their interactions, collaborations with competitors, or even during mergers, becomes the area of concern which is dealt with the application of competition law.
Large multinational law firm in will be delivering the feature of our ESG lecture series on the ESG through the lens of competition law. Our is Dr. Bär, designated of counsel in Brussels and a member of the competition antitrust 25 years, one of the leading advisors in EU and German competition, including Dr. Bertold supported clients in a wide range of sectors, including satellite communications, aerospace and defense, petrochemicals, and so on and so forth. Dr. Bertold has ranked since 2004 in Chambers Global and Legal 500 with special praise of his talent for the work. 2 books and a variety of academic articles on competition law and its related aspects. Moreover, he is also nominated by senior as an active star, recognition as a standard lawyer in private practice. We welcome Dr. Bertold with a round of applause. Second, Dr. Wojewska, an associate in Dentons Berlin office, competition and antitrust practice. She advises EU and German competition law, including merger control, abuse of market, and compliance. Her work in the litigation department of holds leading payment and at a boutique law firm, regulatory and competition law. Part of clerkship with the Unit for Competition Policy, the for Economic Affairs and Energy. Acts as an advisor in merger control proceedings and regarding anti with a open floor for our eminent speakers, and if there are any questions, that will be at the end of the session. The forum is yours, Bertold.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr.
First of all, thank you very much for your warm welcoming. On behalf of Dominika and myself, it is a great honor and privilege to be invited to speak to you today in Maharashtra National Law University. And I want to thank in particular Professor Kiran Rai, Faranas Hazari and Anshika Tyagi, who have been instrumental in connecting us today. And then I suggest that we move to our presentation. And should I probably now share my screen? Oh. Here's the share sign. Can you see the presentation now? Hello? Hello?
So it's not visible.
Can you see the presentation?
No, it's not visible. Sir, we have made you host in the presentation. The screen.
Can you see the presentation now?
No, sir.
Oh, why don't you just put it up then? Unfortunately, I do not master this system so well.
It's okay, sir. We are putting it up.
I think now I can do it. I think I found the way to share it. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir. It is visible now.
Fantastic. So then let us start, and I apologize for this inconvenience. As you know, lawyers and technology are not always the same thing. So today, as you already said, we will speak to you about the role of competition law in ESG. And as you can see from the title of our presentation, it is a limited role because ESG means environmental, social, and governance, and competition law only has a role in environmental. At least today, primarily, things may evolve in the future. And let me say from the outside, the world is changing rapidly, much more rapidly than we thought it would. So competition law also has to change. Otherwise, it cannot serve its function. We will explain later what the function of competition law is. Now we have several types of changes. Yeah, we have climate change, digital change, we had COVID, you know, we have now, at least in Europe, we have a new war. And there are all sorts of societal expectations and political frameworks which are also changing quite rapidly. So everything is undergoing a big transformation. Now, as I already said, antitrust law is already responding to these changes, and regulators all over the world make many efforts to adjust competition law to the new situation. Of course, we will see that the answer is not the same everywhere. And I now hand over to Dominika. Dominika, when you want me to move on to the next slide, you just let me know.
Many thanks, Bertold and everyone. And Bertold, maybe you can press F5 so we can really have like the full screen presentation. That works?
Okay.
Because we see
so
like
I see F5. I don't have any F.
On your
Oh
keyboard.
yeah, I have F5. Does it now? Or is it Alt and F5 or Strong and F5 or? On my screen, it looks like presentation mode.
Okay, so maybe you're sharing a different screen then.
Well, I can try it again. Now, is it better now?
No, it's still like the PowerPoint.
Okay, well, unfortunately.
Well, we can do it like that, but then you need to click on the slides.
I think I need to click on the slides anyway.
Yeah. Okay. I hope this works for everyone.
Okay, let's. On my screen, it's on presentation mode, so.
You can just increase the percentage from down, like the down toolbar. It's 62% currently. You can just do 100.
I'm sorry, but I don't understand this.
Bottom right, there's 64%. You can just increase that.
Where does it say 64%?
There's a bar at the bottom right. Notes, comments, then there's a bar saying 64.
Maybe you want me to share it, Bertold, instead?
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is it better now?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. Now I have an idea. I prefer that Dominika shares her screen. It's much better.
Okay, we'll just make her the host.
Great.
We will try it this way. Sorry. How does it look now?
Yeah, it's full screen now. Thank you.
That's the full screen. Okay, great. So this is what Bertold just said in his introduction, and I will move on now. So one of these factors that Bertold just mentioned that triggers the transformation process is climate change. And while combating climate change is really like one of the most urgent challenges of our times that we face, right? So in the European Union, our political agenda when it comes to combating climate change is the so-called European Green Deal, which aims at CO2 neutrality in 2050. And many other countries have adopted similar political agendas. And this is, of course, an ambitious goal, maybe for some not ambitious enough, but still, it requires quite some effort to achieve this goal, and it will not work without the contribution of the society as such, but also of the economy and individual companies. And we also observe that many companies already adopt their own, sometimes also very ambitious sustainability goals. We see that ESG becomes more and more important. It's a hot topic, really. And investors and other stakeholders, they use ESG criteria to evaluate long-term sustainability of a company. They're taking into account environmental impacts of a company. They use this to make informed decisions. And this increasing focus on ESG topics encourages companies to prioritize sustainability as one important business factor. So now, as competition lawyers that we are increasingly asking ourselves, which role does or can competition law play in reaching these goals, those political goals, but also the individual goals that are part of the ESG agenda of individual companies. To start with, competition law, to have a common basis, is a legal framework that aims at promoting competition and preventing anti-competitive behavior, so behavior that will be harmful to competition on markets. So it actually primarily focuses on economic concerns, but it can indirectly have an impact on the environment as well. Looking at these impacts at first sight, one could argue, well, competition, this is something that aims at higher production rates, lower prices. These factors are usually a competitive advantage for companies, right? But how do you achieve higher production rates and lower prices? Well, one way could be by over-exploiting natural resources. When companies try to cut costs and gain a competitive edge, they may do so without considering the long-term impact on the environment. I mean, companies compete to produce more and sell more goods. That might require burning of fossil fuels and so on. But on the other hand, competition can also promote the development and adoption of sustainable technologies and sustainable products, because competition between companies generally leads to more innovation. And this also includes green innovation, green technologies. And of course, as we just said, demand is changing. Not only investors, but also consumers and other customers in the supply chain become more and more ESG aware. And you cannot ignore that as a company if you want to remain competitive. You have to adapt your business strategy accordingly to that demand, right? So if your products are more sustainable than the products of your competitors, this can give you a competitive advantage. You can increase your market shares. So competition can actually be an incentive to become more sustainable. So we can say that competition can have negative side effects on the one hand on the environment, but it can also have side effects that are actually benefiting environmental sustainability. So it's not generally harmful to the environment. And what we really need is to find some kind of balance between economic growth and competition, which competition law promotes, and environmental protection on the other side, so that they can coexist. And one aspect that maybe complicates finding this balance is that competition law and other broader public interests sometimes have conflicting objectives. So as I said, competition law and its doctrine is very concerned with the competitive process, and consumer welfare is a very economical, a very economical approach. And while we acknowledge that there are negative or positive side effects on the environment, this is not really something we look at under traditional competition law doctrine. Whereas climate preservation and sustainability efforts, they aim at a public interest that goes beyond those economic concerns in a much broader sense. And we call these benefits out-of-market benefits. They refer to benefits, well, occurring outside of the market in which companies compete, and which are traditionally, at least, not really relevant from a competition law angle. And this, well, is not only like a pure theoretical conflict, but very relevant in practice, because a very typical problem that we face in practice is that we have two companies which are competitors, but they want to cooperate and bundle their resources to achieve higher sustainability goals. And I mean, from a general public interest perspective, this is a goal worth supporting, right? So why would competition law be an obstacle here? But then from a competition law angle, such cooperation could be viewed as anti-competitive and in violation of competition law. So those companies approach us and are like, well, what are we supposed to do? On the one hand, we want to do something good, but then we don't want to violate competition law, because competition relies on businesses making independent decisions. So every time competitors cooperate, communicate, this can undermine competition. So we actually view this rather critically. So basically, it can happen that something is good from a sustainability angle, but bad for competition. And this is a conflict that we need to solve. And well, if and how this conflict of objectives can be solved is really the dominating topic in the political, regulatory, legal discussion that we have in our competition law community bubble. And every company really needs to closely watch these developments. They need to stay up to date. Everything is changing rapidly, and they will face a variety of new laws, guidelines, and new administrative practice. Sometimes it's even hard to keep up with these developments, but the good thing is we're still like in the evolution process, and regulators, in particular competition authorities, they are open for dialogue. So this is also a chance for stakeholders to contribute to the debate and shape the debate, really. And also on EU level, there has been an ongoing debate on the revision of the so-called horizontal guidelines. The European Commission has presented a draft that also addresses sustainability issues, and Bertold will now give you a deeper insight into these latest developments at EU level.
Dominika, thank you. That was so well explained. I learned myself from listening to you. Now, let us zoom in a little bit on the more technical aspects of this. So Dominika rightly said, everyone wants to save the planet, everyone wants to protect the environment. But here the question is really more of a legal nature. Yeah. We have a treaty. The treaty gives different, and I speak about the EU treaty. The EU treaty gives specific competences to the European institutions. And in the field of competition law, the European Commission has a very important mandate to preserve competition and to interfere directly with company activities on the markets in Europe. So that is a very important field. On the other hand, the European Commission does not today have a similar power for environmental protection. So if the Commission wants to do something for if the European Union wants to do something for the climate, they have to legislate and directives and regulations, and the member states have then to adopt these laws into national law, etc., etc. And typically in member states like Germany or France, you have not only competition authorities, but also authorities in charge of environmental protection, which have also certain powers. But at the EU level, we have DG Comp, as we call it, the Directorate General for Competition, which has powers to interfere, and we do not have anything similar for environment. So that is basically the institutional setup we are facing. Now, most competition law regimes, or many at least, they are very similar. Yeah? They are based on a few very abstract articles. So the difficulty is, how do you make sense of these abstract articles? Like the Sherman Act In the United States, they said you must not restrict competition, and Article 101 of our EU treaty says you must not restrict competition. What does that mean in daily practice? Now, in the US, you have just this statutory provision, and then the case law from early on has made the distinction between the very bad sort of anti-competitive behavior, like cartels, price fixing, which in America have been labeled per se infringement. So things which are so inherently bad that without any further analysis, they will be prohibited. And then for anything which is based on a more legitimate business collaboration, but may still have anti-competitive effects, for these, the case law has developed the rule of reason test. So the benefits have to be outweighed or have to be balanced against the restriction. So it's a balancing test. Now, in our European system, we have something similar, but it's not exactly the same. So we have a general prohibition of restriction of competition. We call it Article 101, Article 101, paragraph 1. And then we have the possibility, once there is a restriction of competition, we have the possibility to justify the restriction of competition if it leads in one way or the other to efficiencies or synergies. Now, again, the question is, what are these efficiencies? And in the history of antitrust law, different interpretations have been given to what are efficiencies that are capable of justifying a restriction of competition. And those have been, of course, primarily those economic efficiencies that sometimes a collaboration brings about. Yeah, if A and B collaborate to come up with something better, more modern, more efficient, etc., etc. But also efficiencies have occasionally included more broader topics like preservation of jobs. So, which is different from, you know, the more direct efficiencies, which are translated directly in the better quality of the product. So we always had sort of the question, to what extent can wider societal desires be taken account when assessing a restriction of competition? So that is, in very broad terms, a little bit our setup in Europe. It sounds a little bit like that balancing approach in the US, but our Court of Justice had said that it's a different type of exercise. But still, once you have a restriction of competition in the first place, then the question is, do you have efficiencies, and how many efficiencies do you need to outweigh the restriction of competition? And then, of course, as we lawyers know, there's always the question of the burden of proof. So the authority has to establish that an agreement restricts competition. And once it has done so, it can sit and rest. And then the burden is on the companies to justify that their agreement produces efficiencies that are so important that they outweigh the restriction. Now, companies are a little bit the same everywhere in the world. Very often they have very good ideas and they really mean it and are serious. But occasionally you also have companies who are a little naughty, let's say, and who simply pretend that their collaboration is going to lead to great efficiencies. And in the discussion about environmental protection, we call that greenwashing. So competition authorities, they basically have to find ways to distinguish the good from the bad. And that is not always easy. And even in Europe, we have, by the way, we have European Union competition law, which applies to cross-border conduct. But then each of the member states also has its own competition law, and which applies to national conduct. And even in Europe, you find different philosophical approaches to sustainability. For example, the Dutch authority is very open to relaxing a little bit more the standard of competition law. And the Greek competition law is even more enthusiastic about protecting the climate. But you have other authorities who are much more restrictive. And that may be because they say, well, we only have a mandate for competition. So if you want to save the climate, somebody else has to do it. It's not our job. So this is a little bit the situation we face in Europe today. And coming back to what Dominika already mentioned, so there's currently a review process at EU level going on, focusing on agreements on collaborations between competitors. And this is a long document. And there's one chapter which focuses more on sustainability agreements. So what you are hearing today is not yet the last word. We expect the final version of all this in a couple of months from now. But somehow we believe that in this particular chapter, what you hear today is probably 90% what will be the final version. So the question to start with is always, if A and B, or even A and B and C and D and E and F, all competing in the same industry, if they undertake to do something together, which is good for the environment, it can, of course, be a problem for competition, because the rule is companies are supposed to compete with each other on the markets. And as we all know today, even if you claim some sustainability qualities for your products, it influences the consumer choice. If you say my product is the cleanest and the most organic, it's not just some blah blah, it's a competitive advantage if it is true. So the rule is that companies are supposed to compete even where they want to do good things. Now, in order to allow a certain level of collaboration, the guidelines, draft guidelines, they send out some signals about what is unproblematic. And on this slide, you see 3 examples. Typically industry-wide campaigns to raise awareness, such as, let's all be more careful in preserving our natural resources. Also databases for sustainable suppliers, like we want to have a common database to make sure that we all use suppliers who satisfy our sustainability quality standards. Now, of course, if there is a significant price increase resulting from that collaboration, then it is a problem. But if there is no significant price increase resulting from the collaboration, then it is usually also unproblematic, because, as Dominika explained, the primary role of competition law is to protect the wallet of the consumer. And I don't know whether I just did something, but I now see no longer the presentation. Dominika, are you still hosting? Oh, maybe Dominika fell off. And I can try to share my screen again. Can anyone hear me? Hello?
Dr. Bertold?
Yes.
I think Dr. Dominika left the session. Therefore, the screen is not presenting the presentation.
Can you just put it on? That's maybe the easiest.
Sure, definitely. Is it visible?
Not yet. Now it's visible, right? And if you can go in presentation mode.
Definitely.
Fantastic. So this is really sort of coming back to the technicalities. So when we look at sustainability agreements, we have this three-step analysis that are already described in general. So the first question is, does the sustainability collaboration lead to a restriction of competition? For example, because the competitors agree to use more organic packaging material that you can recycle, and that leads to a higher product price. So clearly a competitively sensitive factor. So that is the first step. And if there is a finding of such a restriction of competition, of such an effect, anti-competitive effect, then the next question comes in: does the sustainability create benefits or efficiencies of such a magnitude, or does it create benefits that are passed on to consumers? That is the very important question. For example, if the collaboration leads to the production of organic milk, which has no pesticides, then of course everyone who buys that milk, he pays a little more for it, but then also has a better product. So there is clearly a passing on of the benefit, and the consumers share in those benefits. So the final question then is, well, do the benefits outweigh the restriction, which is a question of how to demonstrate it quantitatively or qualitatively, and I would say more about this. So in this new document, the draft guidelines, the Commission has already indicated that there is one area which they call the soft safe harbor. So agreements which are standardization agreements, sort of industry-wide. And on this slide, you can find the individual criteria. It's 7 criteria that the European Commission uses to signal when such standardization agreements are unproblematic. They call it a soft safe harbor. And these are very sort of common sense criteria, like it has to be a procedure that is open to everyone. Everyone must be able to participate if they wish to participate. Participation should be voluntary. There should always the possibility that members can individually exceed the standards. So there must not be any plafond. Well, this standardization should not lead to the exchange of commercially sensitive information. And finally, whatever is the result of that standardization process, even those who were not participating in the elaboration must have the possibility to join. And then again, there must not be significant price increases, and there should be a monitoring system to make sure that things do not go out of hand over time. And let's move to the next slide. Fantastic. So I will now zoom in even more on what does it mean passing on benefits to consumers, and it can mean different things, as we would say. And by the way, what I present here is the specific response of the European Commission but you will see that the issue structurally will be, I mean, the questions that are addressed are probably the same that will be addressed by any competition authority in the world. So it is a very good insight into the structure of analysis for such agreements. Now, among the benefits that the collaboration can ideally pass on to the consumers, now the easiest one are the so-called individual use value benefits. And that is, to give an example, companies collaborate to grow vegetables organically without pesticides. Now they may then be a little bit more expensive on the market, but the consumer has, of course, the individual consumer has also the value of it. I mean, no pesticides, it's better for your health, and then frequently it also tastes better, than these tomatoes grown in some artificial hangar. So clearly this is easy to understand. This type of collaboration leads to a palpable individual use value benefit, and on top, not only it makes the buyers happy, but on top it produces positive externalities because it's reducing pollution, no pesticides, and that is great just for everyone and for the planet. So this is basically the perfect world. You still have the question on how do you quantify, but the clearer there is a benefit being passed on to consumers, the easier it is to satisfy the question of showing that the benefits outweigh the restriction. And by the way, let me just specify, when I use the terms consumer, I don't mean the consumers in general. I mean the buyers of the product in question, because that's a very important thing. Now, the second type of benefits are still individual, but they are no longer use value benefits. They are called non-use value benefits. And there's also an easy example for this. We all have seen, sort of, when we go to the supermarket, you can buy the standard coffee, which is produced somewhere, in South America with child labor, and the producers are ripped off by the evil companies, etc., etc. But then you also have, increasingly, you have brands, fair trade coffee, and the fair trade coffee may not be any better than basically the evil coffee. It just produced in a better way. And increasingly, this is also something which consumers pay attention to. And again, I mean consumers, the people who are buying the coffee. So it's non-use value benefits because it's more like an ideal thing. I love to do good things. I love to make my own contribution to the environment. So I'm willing to pay 20 cents more for the coffee if I have the assurance that it's produced in a fair way, fair sort of socially, but also protecting the environment, etc., etc. Now, here it is a little more difficult to establish that the benefits outweigh the restriction, because you have to measure consumer preferences, which is a statistical exercise. Now, if it really comes to complicated situations or difficult challenges and investigations, then companies, they use all sorts of economic and marketing experts to try to establish that the benefits outweigh the restriction in their particular case. So marketing studies could be a way to show that the benefits exist and they are passed on and they outweigh the restriction. And maybe we can now move to the next slide. So until now, we've spoken about two types of individual benefits, meaning benefits benefiting efficiencies, benefiting the user who buys the product which is subject to the sustainability collaboration. But now we move to a much bigger picture, and we call it collective benefits. That are the benefits that occur irrespective of what you and I or Dominika may like. And a good example is there is an industry-wide agreement to introduce a green technology. Unfortunately, it's much more expensive, so there is undeniably a cost to the users, to the buyers and the consumers. So the question is then, if these collective benefits exist, how can they be taken into account? And there again, we have different types. Now, the easiest one to start with, it's always good to start with the easy one. The easiest one is in-market benefits. Now, that simply means that, in-market means the restriction of competition leads to efficiencies that benefit the buyers who buy that particular product. And I didn't write an example here, but it's the same as with the milk. So organic milk, I buy the milk. Clearly, there are in-market benefits. So I'm the consumer who buys the milk product in the same relevant product market in which the company sells the milk. So it's in-market benefit. Okay, consumers pay an uplift, but they also benefit from the improvements. Now, the second category, which is a little bit more complicated, is sort of in the separate market benefits. So what if the collaboration leads to benefits in a neighboring market, which is not necessarily the market for the product? And here the example is, what about taxi drivers? Just imagine you have in a city like Mumbai, you have 5 taxi companies, and they all agree to use exclusively clean fuel. And that makes it, of course, a little bit more expensive. So whoever takes the taxi must then pay more money to have that green fuel. And here the Commission says today, you can take those benefits in a related neighboring market into account, provided that the consumers in both markets are substantially the same. And in the example of the taxi driver, that is obviously the case, because the taxi drivers in Mumbai also then breathe the better air from the clean fuel taxi that they use. So there is a substantial overlap. So it's still conceptually easy to take those benefits occurring in the neighboring markets into account. And then the third and the most difficult category are the so-called out-of-market benefits. Now, here, the situation is, or the scenario is a case where, let's say, textile. You have European consumers, they love fashion. And now just imagine that the textile company, let's say Kenzo, says, together with some others, we have an agreement. We will ensure that in the production countries in Africa, these textiles will be produced according to environmentally friendly standards, and no child labor will be used, etc., etc. So something that you can see on the market these days. Now here, it is of course a wonderful thing that they do this, because these are very, very important issues. But the benefit clearly occurs in a totally different geographic market, in Africa, and not in Europe, where then consumers like Dominika and myself have to pay more money to buy our lovely orange shirt, for example. I think, by the way, that Dominika's orange shirt fits very well the colors of your beautiful country, India, because I think that you have a lot of orange in all sorts of traditions. And it's also a calendar like myself very much. So out-of-market benefits are clearly the most difficult ones. And the European Commission, in its draft guidelines, it says very candidly, which is really remarkable, it says, we are not close to the idea of taking these into account, but frankly, we don't have any experience so far. So it will be very important to make an extra effort in establishing those. Meaning that if companies want to rely on such collective out-of-market benefits in particular, they really have to do some homework to figure out, maybe, academic studies, reports from public authorities showing the benefits of this and that, et cetera, et cetera. So the more objective sort of support you find, the more the European Commission will likely be willing to accept even out-of-market benefits. And I personally think that this is a very good development. And I personally also appreciate that the European Commission acknowledges openly that it does not yet have sufficient learning to have a final view on this. And I like it generally when regulators are also open and transparent, just as we as lawyers, we can, of course, try to sort of play games with the regulators. But in my experience of many years, it is much better if you are open and candid and you put the problems on the table and occasionally also disclose your own vulnerabilities. And if everybody does this, it's the best way of creating a rational dialogue and allow things to move forward in the right direction. So that was just my personal comment on this side. And maybe we can just move to the next slide. Very briefly, now, there's one thing we haven't talked about. So everything we talked about is based on this structure. We have a restriction of competition in the first place, and then we put our brain to work to find ways to justify it. But we haven't talked about the opposite. What if here, European Commission, DG Comp, is confronted with an agreement between a couple of competitors, which reduces prices for the consumer? So that is exactly what Dominika said, competition law is all about. But it is very harmful to the environment. What if, you may have read that we have a sort of energy crisis in Europe, because we relied on Russian gas for many years. Now we don't have it anymore. So just imagine you have an agreement, coal companies A and B and C make an agreement to basically produce coal, abundantly coal, very bad for the environment, very bad for the climate, but it reduces the financial burden on the consumers who have to buy heating. So what if a competition authority is confronted with such an agreement? It's of course clearly pro-competitive in the way we traditionally understand it, but does the competition law have the possibility to say we don't like it because it is against our sustainability goals? And let's not forget that in the EU treaty there are some other provisions that says we have to protect the environment. So the question then simply is, what is the mandate of the competition authority? Is it just to look after financial well-being of the consumers, or does consumer welfare also include other wider aspects? Sort of, if competition law protects the competitive process, well, I need fresh air and clean water to compete. If I'm poisoned, I will die and I can no longer compete. So how far can you stretch the mandate that is given to competition authorities? And the answer is different. It depends on the legal basis. You have some jurisdictions where the competition authority is given a wider public interest standard. So for them, it's not a problem to say, yeah, financially we are okay with this, but it's not good for the environment, therefore we don't tolerate it. In the European Union, this question has not yet been tested. I have put it on the table in the recent presentation that I gave at an international conference in Portugal. And my own answer is it's not a clear-cut case, but I also believe that things are moving on, and sometimes, the political side becomes more important than even the legal side. And I think we live in an era where this may be the case. So I wouldn't be surprised to see these things happening, even though in the European Union setup, DG Comp does not clearly have a mandate to protect the environment. So that is something to think about for the future. By the way, I have not looked into how India has phrased the standard.
Dr. Bertold, you're not audible anymore.
And we move to the next slide.
Yes.
Dominika?
Yes. So many thanks for these insights, Bertold. I missed part of it, but yeah. I think we're running a bit out of time, so I'll be very quick here. Competition law does not only cover collaborations between companies, but many other aspects. And one of the sub areas of competition law is called merger control. So if there's mergers and acquisitions, in some cases, they need to be notified to competition authorities, and they will assess the competitive effects. And of course, this whole transformative process, we're moving into this green transition, also affects this sub area of merger control. We realize and we notice in our practice that more and more transactions, like mergers, acquisitions, are driven by also environmental motivations, like companies are acquiring startups that invented new green business models or technologies, for example, and this also reflects on how we define markets, because for our assessment, it's always important to have a defined market. We're looking at a specific market when we're analyzing these effects. So we're continuing to asking ourselves, how do these climate sustainability aspects maybe change those definitions of markets? Or like, is there a market for coffee in general, or should we have sub-markets like fair trade coffee, or Bertold already referred to fair trade coffee today? Is this a different market than regular coffee? And we have new markets that evolve, like e-mobility, for example, because we're not using fossil fuels anymore, or increasingly, and we have charging infrastructure and so on. Yeah, I think I would move to the next slide now, and I think we can skip this one, interest of time, because I wanted to wander off a little bit further into a somewhat different topic, but it's a one that is also very hot in the competition law community because we're not only transitioning into a green, but also into a digital economy. And these are actually two mega trends of our time. And of course, they are also interconnected because digitalization can certainly become a driver of opportunities also for prosperity, but also for the environment. And it actually is not just about big tech companies, but rather all companies are affected as well. Business models are going from offline to online, and many traditional sectors like the automotive industry, for example, they are more and more technology and data driven. And this is also a huge chance for achieving sustainability. We can use digital technology to improve sustainability. And this concept is known as sustainable digitalization. So actually, technologies can contribute to reducing carbon emissions. And we really think that you cannot think the one without the other, digitalization and sustainability. And of course, competition law is also affected by digitalization, and legislators realize that we need a set of rules. And we see also a massive development in this area in many different countries. And all of this means that companies, they have to navigate a very complex terrain, and it would be very desirable actually to further unify the law and enforcement practice. Can we move to the next slide, please? But unfortunately, we're observing a development that is, well, somehow worrying a little bit, because also one trend of our time seems to be deglobalization. So slowly the process of internationalization is reversing, and more countries choose to focus on their national economies, and they are abandoning somehow the idea of a global market. And this really is a thing. I mean, look at the trade war between the US and China. Well, of course, we had Brexit several years ago in the EU. We have the war, we have sanctions, and this all somehow makes the impression that we are moving further apart rather than growing together. And this affects everything. So this can also result, for example, in fewer economies to have access to specific technologies, and technologies that could be crucial also to achieve sustainability goals, right? Next slide, please. So if you wonder what this all has to do with sustainability, it's just that more divergence, which we're facing, actually complicates doing business in general, but also complicates doing sustainable business in particular. So we observe this somewhere critically. And well, we've already said that climate change and combating it is a challenge for mankind, actually. And we should certainly try to stop this trend of deglobalization and rather work on fostering our relations and stay in touch and stay connected, what we do here, which is great. And yeah, I personally believe that coming together, not only companies cooperating, but also nations and regions will help us to achieve those ambitious goals. And yeah, hopefully competition law will in the end make its contribution, or at least not be an obstacle. Yeah, but that's it from my side. I leave the final remarks now to you, Bertold. Many thanks. You are on mute. You are on mute, Bertold.
I thank you, Dominika. I have nothing to add. I think you said it all. We live in difficult times, but let's not despair. You know, let's work on solutions to the problems we face, and I'm confident that the good side will win in the end. And I thank you again for your patience and for your interest. And questions always welcome, also afterwards by email, or now if you have still some time, we still have a little extra window available for questions.
Am I audible?
We cannot hear anything, unfortunately.
Now again.
I'm audible.
Where can you sit in the
So am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. So the perspective of like carbon emission and the like environmental laws and the competition law on that is mainly in the European countries through are driven by the carbon emission, the protection of like protection of land, protection of air in that sense. But when we see to global south, it's more severe than that. Like it's not just air pollution, it's not just carbon emission, it's I mean the groundwater level is decreasing. There are floods that come and it's like the competition law can't be sorry, how do I phrase it? The competition law can't be in a can't sustainable way where we can just like wait for a certain time and let it go, let it be a sustainable in its form. So what I want to say is that the European perspective of climate change and carbon emission is very, I mean, kind of shallow sense and not that severe form of carbon emission that they are like facing right now. So
Yes.
how you see that, like, because the government the yeah, so the
I think you
I want to say that the involvement of state within the
no, proceed. Can you make it short, please?
yeah to shorter sense that within the competition law to make it sustainable, we say that the
You think that competition law is unfit to carry on this business of sustainability?
yeah, especially in global south, because the condition are more severe and the
So then if the conditions are more severe, then shouldn't it be the anyway?
yeah the perspective itself.
I did not catch your first name, but you have a very valid point. Now, the first thing I want to say is each country, should adopt its own laws to deal with its own specific problems. So maybe your Indian competition authority has what I call the public interest mandate to take into account environmental protection aspects more than the classic Western European, etc. competition authority. Now that is the first step. So India must have the laws in place which allow it to deal with its own problems. Yeah. And as you say, and I understand that climatic change is more dramatic in the global south currently than in Western Europe or in the Western world. But then, of course, it to a certain extent, it goes with what we call the internationalization effort. I mean, but let me park it. I will be brief. In our presentation, we only focused on competition law. So it did not give you a full picture of everything that European Union is doing to address climate change. And there's a lot going on. Like people have to renovate their houses to make them more energy efficient. There's a lot going on, if only to reduce the energy bill, because we have to import the energy. So what you have seen today here is just the little bit of what competition law can do in it. And in our case, it's maybe not so much. But to conclude, I think climate change is really the best case for a globalized, unified response, including all the big countries, America, China, India, Europe, you name it. And unfortunately, as Dominika pointed out, we live in times where we are deglobalizing. So it is a little unfortunate that just at the time when we have the most urgent need for global collaboration, the world basically falls into multipolar system. It has its own merit, of course, for many reasons, but on this very specific question of climate change, I'm personally convinced that we need to work all together to get it done, because if we stop producing CO2, but China continues full speed, then what's the purpose of it? So I hope that addressed your concern, partially at least.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that answer. Firstly, I would like to thank you for the PPT that you shared and the knowledge that you disseminated. I just had a very small question that in times of emergency, economic crisis, like recently we had the pandemic, can the countries be obligated to still comply with this ESG policies on a priority basis, or according to you, ESG should take a backseat in those situations?
That's a very good question. I think there are two different things. ESG is becoming more and more important, not only in competition law, but also investors, institutional investors, pension funds, placing their money into companies. They look more and more at ESG. There is a famous individual, Professor Robert Eccles. He has invented integrated reporting. So the annual reports of large companies now start with a chapter on sustainability, diversity, inclusion, all that is ESG. And it's becoming more and more part of the mainstream, no longer just sort of idealistic, we want to live in a more colorful world, but even hardcore business is becoming more and more ESG. Now, so I think that ESG will continue. By the way, unfortunately, again, in the United States, where they're preparing for 2024 presidential elections, the conservative side is now mounting an anti-ESG movement for political reasons, which, again, I'm politically neutral, but I think this is an unfortunate development. But coming back to the crisis, I mean, in Europe, and I speak from the European side, everybody has always criticized the European Union because they can never decide on anything. It's technical, it's complex, blah, blah, blah. Now, it is true that the European Union is a fairly complex mechanism, because it balances the powers between the EU level and the member countries. But we had in the last 15 years, three big crises: the financial crisis of 2008, the COVID crisis of 2019, and now we have the Ukraine crisis. That's the way we call it. And in each case, the European Union has surprisingly found a much more homogeneous way of dealing with the problem effectively. So I have the impression that in our part of the world, the crisis makes the system more effective, which is good. Now, what you see in all three cases, that the responses of the EU level to address the crisis are primarily political and only secondarily legal. So in moments of crisis, the European Union invents, even beyond the treaties, political mechanisms to save banks back in 2008, to buy a vaccine in 2019. Although health policy is not EU competence but national competence, and it is well known that EU does not have clearly developed defense policy. But now, in the context of what we call the Russian aggression on Ukraine, suddenly this has awakened all sorts of people, and things are being done, common procurement, and now and one crisis, every crisis has its own learnings. So in the COVID crisis led to a common purchasing mechanism, EU buying vaccines from Pfizer for everyone, and now they use the same mechanism to purchase ammunition for own use and maybe also to supply to Ukraine. And so in the EU context, which is bureaucratic and complex mechanically, the bigger the crisis, the bigger the awakening, and that is an interesting observation.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Bertold, for your lovely insights. Now, my name is Rohan, and I want to ask a sort of personal opinion on the fact that you have a lot of opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal, and other financial experts also say that ESG is more of something that ESG is not really something that translates into profits, and that ESG funds have consistently underperformed, and sometimes they even have worse labor and compliance records than their non-ESG friendly counterparts. So I just wanted your personal opinion on where do you think this discourse is going to lead in the future? Because some really influential people like Elon Musk have spoken about this on Twitter. And if you still think that people should invest into ESG, then how do you think a layman can identify if some company is greenwashing its products, or how do you think a regular consumer can look at ESG and incorporate it?
No, that is an excellent question, and it's really excellent question. And to be frank, I don't have the answer to it, but I give you my personal opinion. It is, of course, I mean, today everybody talks ESG, but you have to make a distinction conceptually, the true ESG and the false ESG, the greenwashing ESG. I personally believe when it comes to making investment decisions, making the investment decision is very difficult for anyone. So I'm not an investment advisor, by the way. So please don't rely on whatever I say. You may, of course, if you invest your money, you want to have a return. But if you have the choice between investing into a solar company or maybe, into, I don't know, something which does something very bad, maybe you simply want to say, as long as they have similar rate of return, then I go for the greener one because it makes me feel better. So, but there is, of course, a real issue. And then you mentioned Wall Street Journal. I mean, you then also have read that the big petrochemical companies, they had made ESG commitment and to give up fossil fuel, etc. But now they're pedaling back because they're investors, they're shareholders. They want to see the returns. So this is, of course, a concern, because ideally you would want to see the big petrochemical companies to contribute to the energy transition. Like you want to see the German car industry to contribute to the shift to e-mobility, and they're also blocking, as you may have seen in the Financial Times. So it is, of course, I'm not saying we have to, I mean, I think we all agree it's sort of urgent. Yeah? And then the question is, any change is painful. And the more dramatic the change, the more painful it is. And the question ultimately is, how much pain can you stand? Yeah? And if you move into, if now suddenly in 5 years, we have 50 degrees every day and heavy thunderstorms and all our houses are basically destroyed by earthquakes, then I think we're willing to make bigger sacrifices than we may be willing to make today. So I think it's a gradual process.
Before congratulate you, the iota of in fact the web which you have created in our mind through your presentation. We have many questions, interdisciplinary questions, and as of now we have 8 questions. So do we have time to take up those questions, or would you want to cut it short and take only few limited ones?
No, let's go. I mean, I have.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much. So next question can we take?
Good afternoon, sir. Firstly, let me say that the presentation given by you and ma'am was really insightful. I had a question. You talked about separate market benefits as a category, and you mentioned that the consumer base between sectors must be the same. So my question is, apart from the aspect of market share, is there any other rationale behind mandating the same?
Thank you for this question. The market share is indeed an important aspect, and I have not really talked about it because it makes a difference in the analysis if, in particular of collective benefits, it makes a difference if, let's say you have an industry with 10 competitors, yeah? And of the 10, you only have 2 who enter into sort of sustainable agreements, etc. Then if it's only 2 out of 10, it is less likely to produce sufficient sustainability benefits to justify the restriction, because the risk would be that these 2 companies go ahead, they collaborate, it increases the prices, and the others simply take advantage of it, yeah, free riders, yeah, without doing anything sustainable. If on the other hand, out of the 10 companies, you have 8 or 9 that agree on doing something, then the likelihood that benefits are created and passed on to consumers is much bigger. Does that address your question?
Yes, sir.
Next, please.
Good evening, sir and ma'am. My name is Pia, and my question to you is, so the Competition Act in India specifically requires parties to self-assess whether any collaboration that they might have can result in any anti-competitive effects. On the other hand, in countries such as Greece and the United Kingdom, we've seen that their competition regulators have issued very comprehensive guidelines vis-a-vis sustainability agreements and any anti-competitive effects that they may have. So my question is this, in your opinion, can a self-disciplinary mechanism act as a catalyst in increasing anti-competitive behavior, or do we think that this strategy adopted by the Competition Commission of India in asking parties to determine themselves whether any ESG can act as anti-competitive is a good strategy? So just your 2 cents on the same. Thank you.
So this is, again, thanks, Pia, for this other interesting question. I mean, there are basically 2 regulatory models, the one based on self-assessment and the other one based on notification. So in European history, when the European Union started, for the first 50 years or 40 years, they had a notification system. So company A and B were entering into an agreement. They thought, oh, there might be a competition problem. Let's notify the European Commission. And then you would have immunity from fines, because infringement of competition law can lead to a significant fine. Now, this old system, the notification system, it led to overworking the European Commission. The European Commission, there are only so many individuals. They can do, let's say, so many cases per year, but they cannot do 10 times more. And this system turned out to be totally ineffective. So in 2004, the EU moved to self-assessment. So you can no longer notify agreements in very limited cases. You can ask for informal guidance. And then the new trend now in Europe is, since there are all sorts of things in flux, novel things in flux, competition authorities all over Europe are more willing to listen to companies who come with something where they are not totally sure. So even if they are legally supposed to self-assess, if they go to the competition authority and say, look, we're thinking about doing this, but do you think we can do it, or is it going too far, or then although it is no legally sort of, there's no exemption coming from that, but it is obvious that, if you go in and you play with open cards, that even if the competition authority disagrees, that they will not impose a big fine on you. They say, no, you better not do this. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. So I think the truth is in between. So self-assessment is a necessity to avoid overburdening competition authorities, because if you have to notify every nitty-gritty agreement, that's just too many. On the other hand, it is important that competition authorities are willing and able to give guidance in individual cases of a certain importance. Hello? I do not hear anything, so I don't know whether anyone...
Hello, sir, am I audible?
Hello.
Yeah, sir, Shubham here. Good afternoon, and thank you for a wonderful and informative session. Sir, I had a doubt pertaining to CSR. I just wanted to know what's the distinction between ESG and corporate social responsibility?
Probably not much. Corporate social responsibility is simply the idea that a company cannot just focus on profits without giving back to the community. So if the community allows you to become rich, you have to give back to the community. It's almost like building your karma account. So that is CRS. I think in today's world, ESG has become the dominant label. It's a little bit more specific. As CSR is, you have to be nice. And ESG is, there are a couple of things, environment, social governance, where you have to focus on. But maybe one is not excluding the other. Maybe they both continue to coexist. So ESG is how do I shape the activities of my company to make them ESG compliant. And then if I earn a lot of money, I still have to think about CSR, how do I give back to the community?
Sir, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, sir. So thank you for the previous answer. I just had a small doubt. It was regarding in today's world, when we see that there are a lot of developing and developed economies in the world, how can we have a global solution or strategy for the implication, like for implying the ESGs?
Now, very good question. So technically, it is not difficult to have a common proposal. You can organize an international conference with experts and maybe politicians, whatever. But whenever it comes to, international cooperation, a little bit like international public law, it's nice to say it, but then it's difficult to impose a discipline. So within the country, you have government administration. So if you have a car and you park it in the wrong place, then you will be prosecuted. There will be a policeman, and if you don't pay the fine, etc., they will take you to court, etc. Now, in the international world, even if you have hardcore legal principles, there's nobody to enforce them. You have United Nations, and occasionally they have these blue helmet military missions, but it's more like peacekeeping. So there's no real international law enforcement. And similarly, you can have the most beautiful climate agreements. You have nobody to enforce it. That is a problem, and that will remain a problem. So to summarize, I think you can come up with, let's say, a catalog of criteria. This is what everybody should do. But then you inevitably will have to leave it to the goodwill of the individual countries and companies to do this.
Sir, am I audible? Thank you for your answer, sir. So I'm Harsh, and thank you for your presentation. My question is, what I understood from your presentation was that it revolves mainly around the fact that across jurisdictions, there's a lack of uniformity in competition laws. Some cater to the ESG requisites and some are yet evolving. So, sir, from my understanding, can the concept of impact investing, which is more of a profit-oriented concept than ESG, while also catering all the environmental issues, be a solution to the issue of having more of ESG? And can this be a solution towards the problem of competition laws not being ESG ready? And if not, if you don't think so, what are the problems with this solution? Your views on that? Thank you.
Yeah. No, I'm not familiar with the details of impact investing, so I read the newspapers, but maybe not enough. But my general answer is, like in medicine, very often pharmaceutical companies, they want to develop a medicine, a drug for, let's say, a headache, and then they discover by coincidence that it also works for some other disease. So we generally speaking, humanity, we try to be scientific when we think about things, and rational and rationalistic, scientific, but sometimes it's just learning by doing, and it's trial and error. So I think everything is worth being tried, whatever the name you give to it. And then you should, of course, after maybe 5 years, you should review it and say, hey, did this work also for ESG? And if it does work for ESG, perfect, right? So that's the answer that I think, the type of answer that you could give for many similar questions. I think maybe we have to just be more courageous to try out new things, to see whether they will work, and if they don't, we stop trying them.
Thank you, sir, for your previous answer. So my name is Shubh, and I want to ask you that the petrochemical, sir, I'm audible? Sir, I was asking the petrochemical companies of the Gulf account to the 71% of the carbon footprint for the entire planet, and the West has been developing itself and keep making carbon footprint. So why the South Asia, the developing countries, are being accountable to the ESG norms and everyone? Like, we should also develop first and then should be, accountable for all the ESG norms.
these are very important questions, ultimately about justice. Yeah? About justice, because what you describe is simply the result of a historic process. Yeah? And of course, there is a concern, why should we now prevent sort of emerging countries from doing what we in the West have done for the last 150 years, like exploit the natural resources to have a comfortable life. And the justice would probably give you the answer, yes, I mean, now it's their turn, to maybe the Westerners should, step back a little. But then there's maybe the overarching question: how much can we afford? Because and that's, I mean, and then if we come to the conclusion that we cannot all go on like we would like to, then justice would then again maybe suggest that each part of the world makes a sacrifice, and maybe if you guys in the global south make a sacrifice on the CO2 emissions, this coal plants or what, so maybe we can produce, I don't know, some sort of leisurely activities that have a heavy impact on the environment. So there is a little tension between the distributive justice, also measured as a process over time, and simply the current situation, what can we afford, and how pressing is the situation. And then, so it's clearly not a question of competition law, this is more like philosophy, but philosophy is important.
So Dr. Bertold, was I audible?
Sorry?
Was I audible?
No, unfortunately, I did not hear you for the last 2 minutes.
Okay, so a big goof up. Now, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so those said a lot of things. I will just put it in a brief. So I will just like to inform you what Indian competition regulator is doing. So CCI has made a working group called NICE, and the latest diktat that has come to the NICE members, which is a group of academicians to do research on competition law and sustainability. So maybe in 6 months' time, or maybe in next 1 year, India would also be having its draft policy of bringing ESG into competition law and seeing how to take it further. And from the center and from the students of MNLU Mumbai, I would like to thank you, Dr. Dominika and the Dentons law firm, for collaborating with us, for giving the positive response, for being very forthcoming. And we hope to have this next round of deliberations as well on ESG and similar other topics. So thank you very much.
We thank you. It is a privilege to have this exchange. I learned a lot from listening to your question, and I hope we will reconnect soon again.
So thank you once again.